All right, this week's question comes from the crucifixion of Jesus. And the question has to do with the fact that why all the brutality prior to the crucifixion, the mistreatment by the soldiers, the 39 lashings, the spit upon, the crown of thorns, was that really necessary? What's going on there? Well, a few things. Number one is that I think the whole crucifixion event, all of the suffering of Christ, is to show the severity of human sin. In other words, that if Christ became a curse for us, book of Galatians, that to show the severity of our sin and the consequences of human sin and all the suffering that has been introduced into the world and the judgment of God upon it, that there's an extended, painful display of the severity of human sin. Christ became sin for us, 2 Corinthians 5:21. God the Father made him, that is Christ, who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf. And so in that regard, he's a sin bearer. And so because of that, the extensive nature of the suffering of Christ, the abuse at the hands of Roman soldiers, then ultimately the crucifixion, the brutality of the crucifixion, all of these things display the severity of God's judgment that should rightly fall on sinners. And so in some ways it's an incredible portrait of the severity of human sin, and also a portrait of the incredible love of God to bear that on his Son on our behalf. And so that's one reason why the necessity. The second thing is that there's a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. In the celebration of Yom Kippur, the feast of Yom Kippur, where three animals are involved. One animal is the Aaron's sacrifice, or the high priest's sacrifice for his own sins, so he can minister in the Holy of Holies. The second animal is the animal of propitiation, and that animal's blood is shed within the Holy of Holies. And that animal is the propitiation goat. He bears the wrath of God for human sin. And then we have a third animal, the scapegoat, and that animal is an animal to which the high priest puts his hands upon, and then that animal is led outside the city to die alone. In which case, Christ fulfills the first sacrifice of the animal for Aaron is necessary because of the sin of Aaron. But in the case of Christ, he is a perfect high priest and a perfect sacrifice. So there's no need for the first of the three animals from Yom Kippur. The second animal, the propitiation goat, the wrath bearer of God, Christ bears that in the scourging in the inside the city at the hands of the Roman soldiers. Remember, Isaiah 53 says, by his scourging, by his stripes, we are healed. So Isaiah 53 predicts this. And so the scourging of Jesus is both the fulfillment of the scapegoat motif of the Yom Kippur event in Israel back in Leviticus chapter 16, along with being a fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy of Isaiah 53 and the suffering servant. And then we have the death of Jesus as a fulfillment of the third animal in Yom Kippur, the second animal for the community of Israel, the scapegoat, where Jesus is then led outside the city the way they would lead the scapegoat as a means of expiation. The word expiate means to just remove, to pull away. So the consequence and judgment of human sin is then removed from the people in the expiation goat, this scapegoat. And so the sins of the people are transferred to that goat, and the goat is removed from the people. Thus, the consequence of separation between the people and God has been removed, and so now the people can be in right relationship with God. And so Christ fills both of those roles as the propitiation goat and the expiation goat, so that the scourging of Jesus fulfills the first half of the Yom Kippur motif, and the removal of Jesus from the city to die alone outside the city, as it were, fulfills the second motif of Yom Kippur and the expiation goat. In addition to that, like I said, Isaiah 53, which predicts both the scourging of Jesus and his subsequent death in our place, on our behalf, for the sake of human sin. So because of that, what we have is in Christ the fulfillment of Jewish Old Testament. Now clearly, God could have portrayed Old Testament Yom Kippur and Isaiah 53 differently. And so we still have the question of why the severity of the suffering of Christ, because Yom Kippur could have occurred only one animal, not both, those kinds of things. And the answer, again, I think goes back to this fundamental question of the severity of human sin. Human sin is so serious, it's such a severe thing, such a consequential thing and weighty thing, that the Bible portrays that or displays that, not just in Yom Kippur and the shedding of blood by the Lamb inside the Holy of Holies and the shedding of the loss of life of the scapegoat outside the camp. That's the display. But ultimately, those are goats or lambs. Those are animals. It's not quite, not anywhere near the same severity as to see that happen to an innocent human being. And in this case, not just an innocent human being, the very Son of God, the creator of the world, who came and offered himself to freely be abused in this way as a display of the severity of both the judgment of God, the wrath of God, the punishment of human sin by God, and the fact that God has transferred all of that to Christ, so that when we go to heaven, our judgment, our condemnation, the wrath of God, all of those things have been borne in the person of Jesus Christ on our behalf, so that we no longer bear our own sin and guilt. And so I think that's why the extensive nature of the crucifixion event, not just the death of Jesus on the cross, but the death of Jesus, the abuse of Jesus prior to that, displays our severity of our sin, and thus in the depth of the love of God to allow his own Son to go through that level of abuse. All right, good question. We'll see you guys this week.